Story number 1.
I travel a lot for work, mostly driving across states and staying in small towns for a night or two before moving on. Over the years, I've stayed in all kinds of hotels, some nice, some barely better than a roof over my head. I don't get creeped out easily, but there was one hotel that left me shaken in a way I still can't explain. It happened in 2019. I was driving through a stretch of rural Pennsylvania on my way to a client meeting. I had planned to make it to Pittsburgh by nightfall, but a mix of traffic and bad weather slowed me down. The snow started falling harder, and soon enough, the roads were nearly impassable. I knew I had to stop for the night. The town I pulled into barely registered on Google Maps. Just a few buildings, a gas station, and an old hotel that looked like it had been there for at least 100 years. The sign out front flickered weakly, Evergreen Lodge. I was too exhausted to be picky, and my options were limited. I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot and grabbed my overnight bag before heading inside. The lobby was quiet, the air thick with the scent of aged wood and something faintly metallic. The place had the kind of decor that hadn't been updated in decades. Floral patterned chairs, dusty curtains, and an old clock that ticked just a little too loudly. Behind the front desk sat an older woman, probably in her 60s, wearing a sweater that looked like it had been knitted a century ago. Her name tag read, Char Margaret. She looked up as I approached, her expression unreadable. "Need a room?" she asked. "Yeah, just for the night," I replied. "The roads are getting bad." She nodded slowly, then reached for the guest book. Not a computer, but an actual guest book. That should have been my first clue that something was off. "Fill this out," she said, sliding it toward me. I picked up the pen and glanced at the last name written before mine. The ink was faded, and the date next to it was from 3 weeks ago. I hesitated. "Not a lot of guests lately?" I asked, trying to make conversation. Margaret didn't answer right away. She just gave me a thin smile. Not many people come through this way anymore. Something about the way she said it sent a small shiver down my spine. But I told myself I was just being paranoid. I finished signing my name, and she handed me an old brass key. "Room 306, she said. I took the key and started toward the stairs when she added, almost as an afterthought, "Don't leave your window open." I turned back. "What?" She didn't say anything else, just gave me the same thin smile and turned her attention back to whatever she had been doing before I walked in. I shook off the weirdness and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. The hallway was dim, with only a single flickering light at the far end. The carpet was old, faded, and had a musty smell. Room 306 was at the very end of the hall. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was basic: bed, dresser, nightstand, and an armchair by the window. The wallpaper was peeling slightly at the edges, and the whole place had the faint smell of mothballs. I locked the door, tossed my bag on the chair, and collapsed onto the bed. I was too tired to care about the strange atmosphere. After a few minutes, I got up to check out the bathroom. It was small, with a chipped porcelain sink and an old clawfoot tub. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. The mirror had handprints on it, not like smudges from someone touching it accidentally, full, distinct handprints. And they were on the inside of the glass. My stomach dropped. I wiped my hand across the surface, but the prints didn't disappear. They weren't on the outside. It was as if someone had pressed their hands from the other side of the mirror. I backed out of the bathroom, telling myself it was just an old mirror that maybe the glass had warped over time. But the unease had settled in my chest now, and I couldn't shake it. I turned on the TV for some background noise and sat in bed, scrolling through my phone. No service. Not even one bar. I sighed and put it down. Outside, the snow was coming down heavier now, covering the streets below in a thick white blanket. I was about to turn off the light and try to get some sleep when I remembered what the old woman had said. "Don't leave your window open." Curious, I walked over to the window and checked the latch. It was closed. But as I pulled back the curtains, I froze. There were footprints in the snow outside. On the 3rd floor ledge, I felt my pulse hammering in my throat. The prints started at the far end of the ledge and led directly to my window. Someone had been standing there. I grabbed the latch and yanked it again, making sure it was locked. Then I backed away from the window, my breath coming fast. A loud creak sounded from the hallway. I whipped my head toward the door. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They stopped right outside my room. I stood completely still, barely breathing. Then 3 soft knocks. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't move. The doorknob rattled. I stumbled backward until my legs hit the bed. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps retreated down the hall, growing fainter and fainter until they disappeared. I didn't sleep that night. I kept every light on, sitting on the bed with my back against the headboard, waiting for morning. At the first light of dawn, I grabbed my bag and left the room, hurrying down the stairs. Margaret was still at the front desk, as if she hadn't moved all night. She looked up as I approached, and for the first time, I saw something in her expression that unsettled me even more than the night before. Pity. "You slept in 306, she said, more of a statement than a question. I swallowed. "Yeah," she nodded slowly. "You saw something, didn't you?" I didn't answer. After a moment, she sighed. "We don't rent that room out often." "Then why'd you give it to me?" My voice came out harsher than I intended. She hesitated. "It chooses people sometimes." I felt a cold chill creep up my spine. "What does?" She just shook her head. "Some people leave and never talk about it again." I stared at her. "And the others?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "They don't leave." I didn't ask anything else. I didn't want to know. I just turned and walked out the door, the snow crunching beneath my boots as I hurried to my car. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced up at the 3rd floor. The curtains in room 306 were open, and someone was standing there. Not Margaret, not another guest. Someone else. Someone tall, thin, with empty, black eyes. Watching me. I didn't look back again. I drove until I was far from that town, until the hotel was nothing but a fading memory in my rearview mirror. But I still have nightmares. And sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I hear those 3 soft knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I was never one to believe in ghost stories. I always thought they were exaggerations, the products of overactive imaginations or urban legends, twisted over time. But what happened to me in the summer of 2019 changed the way I think about the things we can't see, the things that might be watching when we don't even realize it. I had been driving for nearly 10 hours, making my way from Chicago to Denver for a work-related conference. My plan had been to power through and reach my destination in one day, but exhaustion had other ideas. By the time I hit central Nebraska, my eyelids were heavy, and I knew I had to pull over for the night before I veered off the road. It was nearly midnight when I saw the sign, Pinecrest Lodge Vacancy. It wasn't a chain hotel, just a small roadside lodge nestled at the edge of a wooded area. The building looked old, but not abandoned. It had a long, L-shaped structure with rooms lined up side by side. The neon sign flickered, and a single light glowed from the lobby window. I pulled into the gravel lot and turned off my car, stretching my stiff limbs. The night was eerily quiet, the trees in the distance swaying gently in the wind. There were only 2 other cars parked outside, one directly in front of a room and another near the office. I grabbed my bag and made my way inside. The lobby smelled of dust and stale coffee. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman, her white hair pulled into a bun. She looked up as I entered, her expression unreadable. "Just you tonight?" she asked. I nodded, too tired for small talk. "Yeah, just passing through." She slid a book across the counter. The pages yellowed with age. I found it strange that they still used a logbook instead of a computer, but I wasn't in the mood to question it. I signed my name, and she handed me a key. "Room 6, she said. "End of the hall." I turned to leave, but her voice stopped me. "If you hear anything strange in the night, don't open the door." I froze, unsure if I had heard her correctly. "Excuse me?" She gave a small, tired smile. "This place is old. Sounds carry. Just don't go looking for something that isn't your business." Her words unsettled me, but I forced a polite nod and took the key. The hallway smelled of old carpet and something faintly metallic. The lighting was dim, flickering slightly as I walked. When I reached room 6, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was small, just a bed, a desk, a chair by the window. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, and the air felt thick, like it hadn't been circulated in a long time. I set my bag down and went into the bathroom to wash up. As I splashed water on my face, I suddenly felt watched. It wasn't paranoia. It was something palpable. I turned sharply, expecting to see someone behind me. But the room was empty. I shook my head, chalking it up to exhaustion. After changing into a t-shirt and sweats, I turned off the lights and climbed into bed. I must have dozed off because when I woke up, the room was pitch black. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then I heard it, a soft shuffling sound. It was faint, coming from outside my door. I held my breath, listening. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, bare feet against the carpet. They stopped directly outside my room. Then, knock, knock, knock. My stomach clenched. The knock wasn't loud. It was gentle, almost hesitant, but there was something wrong about it. I glanced at the clock. 3:12 a.m. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. Then I remembered the old woman's warning. If you hear anything strange in the night, don't open the door. The knob rattled, not violently, just a soft, testing jiggle. My pulse pounded in my ears. Whoever was out there wasn't knocking for help. They weren't a guest looking for the wrong room. They were waiting. I didn't move. I didn't speak. And after a few agonizing minutes, the footsteps continued down the hall, growing fainter until there was silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At sunrise, I packed my bag and left the room without a second glance. The hallway was empty. The motel felt still. I hurried to the front desk where the old woman was sitting exactly where I had left her the night before. "I'd like to check out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't look surprised, just nodded and reached for the logbook. "Room 6, right?" I nodded. She flipped a few pages and frowned. "That's odd," she murmured. I swallowed. "What?" Her pale eyes met mine. "We haven't rented out room 6 in weeks," she said. "It's not in the system." I felt my skin go cold. "But you," I shook my head. "You checked me in last night. You gave me the key." She stared at me for a long moment. Then she reached under the counter, pulling out a heavy metal box. She unlocked it, rifling through a set of old keys. My stomach flipped when she pulled out a key labeled Room 6, the same key I had returned not 5 minutes ago. I took a shaky step back. The old woman sighed, shaking her head. "I tell people not to open their doors," she said quietly, "but sometimes even that isn't enough." I left without another word. As I stepped into the parking lot, I glanced back at the motel, and that's when I saw it. The curtains in Room 6. They were drawn closed when I left. But now they were wide open, and behind the glass stood a tall, thin figure, watching me. I nearly tripped running to my car. I threw it into drive and sped off down the road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I don't know what I encountered that night, but one thing still haunts me. If I had opened the door, just once, would I have been able to leave at all? Story the end.
Story number 3.
I used to work as a traveling consultant, which meant I spent more nights in hotels than in my own home. The first few years, it was exciting. New cities, different rooms, a constant change of scenery. But after a while, all hotels started feeling the same. Sterile halls, recycled air, and the distant hum of ice machines at 2 a.m. One particular work trip, however, changed the way I see hotels forever. It was early 2018. I had been sent to a small town in Pennsylvania for a 3-day client visit. The company was paying for my accommodations, but since it was a last-minute booking, I wasn't put up in one of the usual chain hotels. Instead, they reserved a room for me at the Mayfield Grand, a historic hotel that had been in operation since the early 1900s. I wasn't thrilled. I preferred modern hotels, clean, predictable, impersonal. Old hotels had too much history. When I arrived, the Mayfield Grand was exactly what I had dreaded. A looming brick building with ivy creeping up the sides, it looked like something out of an old photograph. The sign outside flickered slightly in the twilight, and the entrance had heavy wooden doors that creaked as I pushed them open. Inside, the lobby was grand but dimly lit, with antique furniture and a long, worn-out reception desk. An older woman with sharp eyes and a rigid posture checked me in. Her name tag read, Miriam. She slid an actual metal key across the counter toward me. "You're in room 306, she said in a clipped tone. "Please don't use the elevator after midnight." I frowned at that. "Why not?" She hesitated. "It's old. Sometimes it gets stuck." I shrugged. Fair enough. The elevator, like the rest of the hotel, was ancient. It had a brass gate that had to be pulled shut before the outer doors would close. As it creaked up to the third floor, I noticed the air felt heavy, like I had walked into a room that hadn't been opened in years. My room was at the very end of the hallway. The carpet was threadbare, and the wallpaper was peeling at the edges. When I unlocked my door, a strange smell greeted me, like old books and something faintly metallic. The room was small. A bed, a wooden dresser with a dusty mirror, and a desk near the window. The decor hadn't been updated in decades, and the dim yellow light did little to make it feel welcoming. I set my suitcase down and went to close the curtains when I noticed something odd. Across the street was another building, abandoned and dark, but in one of its windows directly across from mine, I could see someone standing there. A figure, unmoving, watching. I shivered, stepping back. Maybe it was a mannequin or a trick of the light. I shut the curtains. The first night I slept fine, but the second night, that's when things went wrong. I had worked late and returned to my room exhausted. As I was getting ready for bed, I heard a faint knock, not at the door, at the closet. I turned slowly, my stomach twisting. The closet door was shut. It had been shut all day. I held my breath, waiting. Another knock. Soft, deliberate. I walked toward it, every instinct telling me not to. My hand hovered over the knob, but something in me refused to turn it. Instead, I grabbed one of the room's chairs and jammed it under the doorknob. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I went to the front desk and casually asked Miriam if someone else had a key to my room. Maybe housekeeping or maintenance. Her expression remained neutral, but there was something guarded in her eyes. "No one's been in your room since you checked in," she said. I nodded slowly, unsure whether to press further. Instead, I asked, "Has anyone ever said this place is haunted?" A small, humorless smile touched her lips. "People say a lot of things." That night, I double-locked my door and kept the bathroom light on. At around 2 a.m., I woke up freezing. The air in the room was ice cold, and the pressure in my ears felt like I was deep underwater. Then I heard it. The closet door creaked open. The chair I had wedged against it, it was still in place. But the door had opened anyway. I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. Then, from the darkness of the closet, I heard a sound that I will never forget. A whisper right next to my ear. "Get out!" I shot out of bed, grabbed my bag, and ran. The hallway was silent, the lights flickering slightly. The elevator was at the far end, but something in me refused to use it. I took the stairs, practically throwing myself down them. When I reached the lobby, Miriam was still at the front desk, her hands folded neatly. She wasn't surprised to see me. "You're checking out early," she said, more of a statement than a question. I nodded, unable to speak. She reached for the guest book. "Room 306? I nodded again. She sighed and flipped to a separate section in the book, pulling out a pen. She wrote something down and closed it before I could see. Then she handed me my receipt. As I turned to leave, she said one last thing. "You're lucky you listened." I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't want to know. I left and never looked back. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for anything about the Mayfield Grand. There wasn't much. A few old articles about its history, but nothing recent. Then I found an old forum thread from 2011. Someone had posted about Room 306. A businessman had stayed there in the 1970s and was found dead in the closet. The official cause was ruled a heart attack, but the staff whispered about the way his body was positioned, as if he had crawled inside the closet to hide from something. Another guest in the 90s reported waking up to see the closet door slowly opening on its own. Every story ended the same way, with a whisper in the dark, and those two words, "Get out." I don't stay in old hotels anymore. I don't care how nice they look, because sometimes a room isn't just a room, and sometimes when a place tells you to leave, you should listen. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
I had always been one to enjoy solo road trips. There was something calming about driving long stretches of highway alone, just me and the road. So when I decided to take a last-minute trip out to a remote part of the country, I didn't think much of it. I booked a room at an old hotel that I found through a quick online search. It was cheap, and I thought it would be a nice place to rest for the night before continuing my journey. I arrived in the town well after sunset. The sky was an eerie shade of deep blue, and the cold air carried the scent of rain. The hotel was located just outside the town proper, and it was one of those old historic buildings that you could tell had once been grand, but now had an air of neglect. The signage was rusted, and the windows were dark, as if no one had bothered to light them for years. But I was too tired to care about aesthetics. I parked in front of the lobby and got out of my car, the sound of my boots tapping against the cracked pavement echoing through the silence. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, with an old chandelier hanging from the ceiling. The air smelled stale, like old furniture and dust. The receptionist, a middle-aged man with a graying beard and a flannel shirt, looked up from his newspaper as I entered. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice thick with a regional accent I couldn't quite place. "I have a reservation," I said, trying to smile. "For tonight." He didn't seem particularly interested in my presence, but he checked the log behind the desk and handed me a brass key. "Room 212. Up the stairs, second floor," he muttered, not making eye contact. "Just make sure to lock the door. These old places are always a little creaky." I nodded, not really thinking about his odd warning. I thanked him, took the key, and made my way upstairs. The hotel had a narrow staircase that creaked with every step I took. The walls were lined with wallpaper that had long since begun to peel, revealing patches of mold underneath. I tried not to look at it as I walked by, but the smell of dampness was starting to make me feel uneasy. Room 212 was at the end of a long, dim hallway. The carpet was old and frayed, and the walls seemed to close in on me as I approached the door. I slipped the key into the lock and turned it, hearing the soft click as the door opened. The room itself was a strange mixture of old and new. It had a vintage bed with a carved wooden headboard, but the sheets were freshly made and the small television on the dresser looked new enough to have been purchased in the past decade. The windows were covered with thick, heavy curtains that blocked out any light from the outside, casting the room in near darkness. I flicked on the bedside lamp and closed the door behind me. As I unpacked my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air in the room was thick, almost suffocating, and the silence felt oppressive. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. After all, it had been a long drive, and the isolation of the hotel was beginning to get to me. I decided to freshen up before bed, so I went into the bathroom. It was small, with a cracked mirror above the sink and a tub that looked like it had seen better days. As I brushed my teeth, I noticed something odd. The water from the sink had a faint reddish tint to it. It wasn't enough to be alarming, but it was enough to make me pause for a moment. I turned off the faucet and splashed my face with cold water, hoping to shake off the unease I was feeling. When I left the bathroom and returned to the room, I heard something. At first, it was just a faint sound like a distant whisper. I stopped in my tracks, listening intently. The sound seemed to be coming from above me, like someone was walking around in a room directly overhead. But the hotel was so quiet, and I was the only guest staying on this floor. At least, that's what I had assumed when I checked in. I waited for a moment, but the sound didn't stop. Instead, it grew louder, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just the building settling, I thought. Or maybe there was someone else in the hotel who had checked in late. But the noise persisted, and it began to unsettle me. I lay down on the bed, pulled the covers over myself, and tried to fall asleep, hoping the sounds would stop. As I drifted off, I heard something else. A door creaking open, followed by faint footsteps on the wooden floor. I shot upright in bed, heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if someone was walking toward my room. I froze, not daring to move or make a sound. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I held my breath, listening for any other noise. There was nothing. The silence was deafening. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly got out of bed and tiptoed toward the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I didn't want to open it. What if someone was standing out there? What if I was imagining things? But before I could gather the courage to check, I heard something else, a soft knock on the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively backed away from the door. I was paralyzed with fear. Who could possibly be knocking at this hour? The man at the front desk had told me I was the only guest on the second floor. There was no one else here. Yet someone was knocking on my door. I stood still for a moment, my mind racing. Should I answer it? Should I call down to the front desk and ask if someone else had checked in? My hands were shaking as I reached for the phone on the nightstand, but when I picked it up, there was no dial tone. The line was dead. I backed away from the door, not knowing what to do. The knocking stopped, but then the door handle rattled as if someone was trying to get in. I held my breath and listened, my heart pounding in my chest. The handle jiggled again, more forcefully this time, but then it went silent. I stood in the dark room, my mind spinning. Was I imagining all of this? Was I just tired from the drive? But the knocking, the footsteps, the rattling of the door handle, it all felt too real. I decided to leave the room. I grabbed my bag, stuffed a few essentials inside, and slipped out of the room quietly. As I stepped into the hallway, I glanced down the corridor, half expecting to see someone standing at the end, waiting for me. But the hallway was empty. The silence was overwhelming, and the air felt thick, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I made my way back downstairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. The man behind the desk didn't look up as I approached. He was still engrossed in his newspaper, as though nothing was unusual. I cleared my throat, trying to steady my voice. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. I think there's someone in my room. Someone's been knocking on my door." He looked up, his eyes narrowing. "That's impossible. You're the only guest on this floor." "I'm not imagining it," I said, feeling the panic rising in my chest. "There's someone upstairs. I heard them." The man slowly stood up, his expression hardening. "I told you to lock the door. Old buildings like this can play tricks on you." He didn't seem concerned at all. I stood there, unsure of what to do next. Part of me wanted to leave, to get in my car and drive away from this place. But I felt a strange pull, as if I was meant to stay, to uncover whatever was happening here. "Do you have another room available?" I asked hesitantly. He stared at me for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "I have room 305. It's a bit further down the hall on the 3rd floor. You can take that one if you want." I nodded, grateful for the option but still uneasy. I took the key he handed me and made my way back up the stairs. The air felt even colder as I ascended, and the creaking of the stairs seemed louder, more ominous. Room 305 was just as old as 212, but there was something different about it. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The room was colder, the air heavier. I looked around, expecting to see something strange, but nothing appeared out of place. I locked the door behind me and checked the windows. They were all sealed shut. I pulled the curtains back slightly, but the street outside was deserted. Everything seemed still. I lay in bed, wide awake, my eyes darting around the room as I listened for any signs of movement. But the hotel was silent. I kept expecting to hear footsteps or knocking or the rattling of the door handle, but it never came. By the time the sun began to rise, I had convinced myself that it had all been a dream. I gathered my things, checked out of the hotel, and left as quickly as I could, but as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind. Something was still waiting in that hotel. Something I had not yet uncovered. Story the end.
Story number 5.
Here's a fully immersive and realistic horror story set in a hotel. I was in my early 30s when this happened. I used to work for a company that required me to travel constantly, sometimes at a moment's notice. The hours were long, the stress was relentless, but the pay was good. That was enough for me at the time. One particular work trip took me to a small town in Tennessee. The company had booked me a stay at the Holloway Inn, a hotel I had never heard of. A quick online search told me it was an old, independently owned place. Not a chain, not a well-known establishment, just a 3-story building with a faded sign and an outdated website. But the pictures looked decent, and I wasn't in the mood to be picky. I arrived late in the evening after a long drive. The hotel sat on the outskirts of town, away from any major roads or businesses. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for a few scattered cars. The exterior had once been white, but had since faded into a dull gray, stained from years of exposure to the elements. The neon sign flickered, struggling to stay lit. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood. The front desk was a massive wooden structure, scuffed from decades of use. Behind it stood a woman in her 60s, dressed in a beige cardigan, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun. Her name tag read, Elaine. "Checking in?" she asked, her voice tired but polite. I nodded and gave her my name. She flipped through an actual paper reservation book before grabbing an old-fashioned metal key from the board behind her. "You're in room 209, she said, sliding it toward me. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Don't leave your door unlocked, even for a second." I raised an eyebrow. "Why?" She hesitated. Security reasons. It was an odd thing to say, but I brushed it off. Maybe they'd had break-ins before. The elevator was ancient, with tarnished brass doors and an interior lined with a dusty red carpet. It groaned as it carried me to the second floor. The hallway smelled musty, like old fabric and something faintly metallic. The light fixtures flickered slightly, casting long, wavering shadows. My room was simple. Queen bed, wooden desk, a TV that looked like it hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and the carpet had stains that had long since faded but never disappeared. I set my bag down and went to draw the curtains when I noticed something strange. The room across the hall from mine, room 210, had a small metal latch bolted onto the outside, like it had been locked from the outside. That wasn't normal. I stared at it for a moment, feeling an inexplicable unease creep up my spine. Then, convincing myself that it was none of my business, I shut my door and locked it. The first couple of hours were uneventful. I showered, changed, and sat on the bed watching TV. But around midnight, things started getting weird. I heard shuffling from the hallway, slow, deliberate footsteps. They stopped right outside my door. I muted the TV, straining to listen. Then, a soft knock. Not at my door. At room 210. I sat up, my pulse quickening. I waited, expecting to hear someone answer, but there was nothing. Then came the knocking again, more urgent. I stood up and moved toward the peephole. My hands were suddenly cold, my skin prickling. I hesitated before looking through. The hallway was empty. No one was there. But I still heard the knocking. I backed away, my heart pounding. Maybe someone was playing a prank, or maybe the front desk had accidentally checked someone into a locked room. I tried to ignore it. I turned the TV's volume back up and focused on the screen. Then around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of my bathroom faucet running. I hadn't left it on. I sat up slowly, dread curling in my stomach. The room was dark except for the dim glow from the TV. The bathroom door was half open, the light flickering. I forced myself to get up. My legs felt stiff, my body unwilling. I stepped into the bathroom. The sink was running at full blast. The moment I touched the faucet, the light went out completely. I froze. The darkness felt suffocating, pressing against me like something alive. Then I heard it, a faint, wet whisper right next to my ear. "Get out." I bolted out of the bathroom, grabbed my phone, and flipped on the flashlight. My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking. I wanted to believe I had imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I saw the closet door. It was open. I hadn't touched it. I grabbed my keys and left the room, not even bothering to change out of my sweatpants. The hallway was empty, but as I passed room 210, I heard something on the other side. A faint scratching. Slow, methodical, like fingernails against wood. I ran down the stairs. Elaine was still at the front desk, reading an old paperback novel. She looked up, unsurprised, as I approached. "I need a different room," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Something's wrong with mine." She sighed, setting her book down. "What happened?" I hesitated. I didn't want to sound crazy. The sink turned on by itself, and I just don't feel safe up there. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "I'll move you to the first floor, room 103. I took the new key without another word. As I turned to leave, she said, almost too casually, "You didn't open the door, did you?" I stopped. My stomach twisted. "No." "Good." I didn't ask her to explain. I just left. Room 103 was better, or at least it felt that way. It was closer to the lobby, warmer, and didn't have that awful, musty smell. I locked the door, shoved a chair against it, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I checked out as early as possible. As I was loading my suitcase into the car, I noticed something strange. From the parking lot, I had a clear view of the hotel's second floor. The window to room 210 was open. A curtain fluttered in the breeze, and standing behind it, just barely visible, a figure. Watching me. I got into my car and sped away. I don't know what happened in room 210, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I stay in a hotel, I'll wake up in the middle of the night to an odd sound, a faint scratching. And I wonder if it ever left. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I travel frequently for work. It's part of the job, city after city, hotel after hotel, until they all blur together. Most of them are forgettable, just a place to sleep before the next meeting or flight. But there was one hotel that I will never forget. I don't talk about it much because I still don't fully understand what happened. Even now, years later, the memory unsettles me. It was late October when I arrived in Charleston for a 3-day business trip. The main hotels downtown were booked solid because of a festival, so my assistant managed to find a room in an older boutique hotel just outside the historic district. It was called the Fairmont Manor, a 3-story brick building with ivy crawling up the walls and heavy wooden doors that creaked when they opened. It had that old Southern charm, the kind of place that made you feel like you had stepped back in time. When I arrived, the lobby was empty except for the woman at the front desk. She looked up and smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was polite, forced, like she was going through the motions. "Welcome to Fairmont Manor," she said. "Checking in?" I nodded, giving her my name. She pulled out an actual guest book. No computer, no reservation system. She flipped through the pages, found my name, and handed me an old-fashioned brass key. "Room 303, she said. Then, after a pause, she added, "If you need anything during the night, please call the front desk. But don't leave your room after midnight." I frowned. "What?" She smiled again, that same empty expression. "We like to keep things quiet after hours." I was too tired to argue. I took the key and headed for the stairs. The carpeted hallway smelled of aged wood and something faintly floral like lavender. My room was at the very end of the hall. Room 303 was small but clean. The furniture was antique, dark wood, heavy drapes, a writing desk by the window. The bed was a 4-poster with thick blankets, and a single painting hung above it. It was a portrait of a man in old-fashioned clothing, his dark eyes staring directly ahead. Something about the room felt still. Not in a peaceful way, but in an unnatural way, like it hadn't been touched in years. I shook off the uneasiness, unpacked, and checked my phone. No Wi-Fi. No signal. Great. I took a quick shower and got into bed. I planned to review my notes for my morning meeting, but I was exhausted. The last thing I remember was glancing at the old clock on the nightstand, 11:45 p.m., before drifting off. I woke up to the sound of knocking. 3 soft, deliberate knocks. I opened my eyes, groggy, disoriented. The room was pitch black. The knocking came again. It was coming from inside the room. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up slowly, straining my ears. The sound wasn't from the door, it was from the closet. I stared at it, my pulse pounding. The door was closed. Had it been closed before? I couldn't remember. I reached for my phone, but the screen was dead. The clock on the nightstand read 12:03 a.m. I swallowed hard, telling myself I was imagining things. Old buildings make noise. Maybe the pipes were knocking. Maybe it was 3 more knocks, louder this time. I wasn't imagining it. I sat there, frozen, every muscle tense. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. Silence. I let out a shaky breath and lay back down, my heart still racing. I told myself it was nothing. I was overtired, stressed. My mind was playing tricks on me. I turned on my side, facing away from the closet, and pulled the blanket up to my chin, and that's when I heard the door creak open. I stopped breathing. It was slow, deliberate. The sound of wood shifting against wood. I squeezed my eyes shut. I didn't want to see, but I felt it. The air changed. The room grew colder, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the curtains. The closet door was open, not just a little, wide open. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my bag, threw my clothes into it, and left the room without even changing out of my pajamas. When I reached the lobby, the woman at the front desk was there, watching me. "You're leaving early," she said. I hesitated. "What's wrong with that room?" She tilted her head slightly. "Did you leave it after midnight?" I shook my head. "No, but..." "Good," she interrupted. "That's good." I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded an explanation. But something in her tone told me I didn't want to know. I left without another word. Later that day, I tried looking up the hotel's history. There was almost nothing about it online. No reviews, no website. It was like the place barely existed. The only thing I found was an old newspaper article from the 1920s. A guest had disappeared from room 303. His belongings were left behind, the bed unmade. The only sign of a struggle was the closet door, which had been found wide open. He was never seen again. I haven't traveled to Charleston since, but sometimes in the middle of the night, I wake up thinking I hear knocking, and I wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I was never someone who believed in the paranormal. I've always been logical, practical. Ghost stories were just that, stories. That was until the night I stayed at the Hawthorne Hotel. I was in town for a conference, and due to a booking mishap, my assistant had to find me a last-minute place to stay. Everything in the city was fully booked except for one hotel I had never heard of. She assured me it had decent reviews, though it was old. The Hawthorne Hotel stood at the edge of the historic district, a 6-story brick building with wrought iron balconies and a grand entrance that had probably been impressive decades ago. Now it looked worn down, the kind of place that hadn't kept up with time. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. Something was off. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of old wood, and something else, something stale. The lobby was dimly lit with antique furniture and faded rugs. The man at the front desk barely looked up when I approached. Checking in, his voice was dry, almost bored. I gave him my name and he flipped through an actual paper ledger. No computer system. That should have been my first red flag. Room 609, he said, handing me an old-fashioned brass key. Elevators down the hall. As I turned to leave, he added almost as an afterthought, avoid the end of the hallway at night. I paused. Excuse me? He looked at me then, his expression unreadable. Just stay in your room after dark. I forced a chuckle. What, is the place haunted? He didn't smile. Have a good night. I carried my suitcase to the elevator, shaking off the strange interaction. The ride up was slow, the old metal cage rattling as it ascended. When the doors opened, I stepped into a long, dimly lit hallway lined with dark wood paneling and faded wallpaper. The carpet was a deep burgundy, worn down in places. My room was at the far end of the hall, just before the section the front desk clerk had warned me about. I glanced down the corridor. It stretched into darkness, the last few doors barely visible. I ignored the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine and entered my room. It was strange. Not dirty, but there was an unsettling stillness to it. The furniture was heavy, antique, the kind that felt too big for the space. The bed had an ornate wooden headboard, and a single oil painting hung above it, a landscape of a dark forest. The window overlooked the alley, and when I pulled back the curtain, I saw another window directly across from mine in the neighboring building. It was dark, but I had the distinct feeling that someone had been standing there just moments before. I shook off the unease and got ready for bed. By 11:30 p.m., I was lying down, flipping through emails on my phone. The hotel Wi-Fi was spotty, and my service was weak. Frustrated, I finally set the phone aside and turned off the light. That's when I heard it, a soft scratching sound. I sat up, listening. It was faint, almost like nails dragging along wood. It was coming from the closet. I told myself it was just the old building settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was on the other side of that door. Then the scratching stopped. Silence. I exhaled slowly and lay back down. Maybe I was just tired. Then, at exactly midnight, the knocking started. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not on my door, on the door at the very end of the hallway. I sat up again, my pulse quickening. The front desk clerk's warning echoed in my mind. Avoid the end of the hallway. I climbed out of bed and crept toward the door, pressing my ear against it. Silence. I should have left it alone. I should have ignored it. But something in me needed to know. I cracked my door open just enough to peek into the hallway. The corridor was empty. The dim light from the sconces cast long shadows along the walls. The door at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar. And then, just as I was about to close my door, I saw movement, a shadow. It slipped past the open door, moving into the darkness beyond. My breath caught in my throat. I shut my door quietly, locking it. My heart was hammering, my skin cold. I climbed back into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin like a child. Then the knocking came again. This time it was on my door. 3 slow knocks. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. The air in the room grew heavy, thick, the temperature dropped. Then the doorknob rattled. I grabbed my phone, but the screen was black. Dead. The knob rattled harder, like someone was testing the lock. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I stayed awake for hours, listening, waiting, but nothing else happened. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke, the room was bright with morning light. Everything looked normal. Had I imagined it? I dressed quickly and packed my things, determined to check out early. When I reached the front desk, the same man was there. "Everything all right?" he asked. I hesitated. "Something weird happened last night." He didn't look surprised. "The knocking?" he asked. I nodded slowly. He sighed, rubbing his temple. "You weren't supposed to open the door." "I didn't." He studied me for a long moment, then said, "Good." I leaned forward. "What the hell is going on in this place?" The man hesitated, then said, "Room 617. It's been empty for years, but sometimes it doesn't stay that way." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't ask any more questions. I left the hotel and never looked back. That was years ago, but sometimes late at night, I wake up to the sound of knocking, and I wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I had been on the road for nearly 10 hours when I finally decided to stop for the night. It was early November, and the cold had settled deep into the mountains of West Virginia. My original plan was to make it to Charleston, but a combination of exhaustion and the winding, nearly deserted roads forced me to call it quits. I spotted a motel sign flickering on the side of the highway, a place called the Red Pines Inn. It wasn't much, just a long 2-story building with an empty parking lot and a front office that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The neon sign buzzed loudly, casting a sickly red glow over the wet pavement. I pulled in, parked my car, and made my way to the front desk. Inside, the place smelled like stale coffee and something fainter, something metallic that I couldn't quite place. A man sat behind the counter, middle-aged, with greasy hair and a pair of glasses that kept slipping down his nose. His name tag read, "Carl." "Need a room?" he asked, not looking up from the small TV playing behind the desk. "Yeah," I said, "just for the night." Carl finally turned to look at me. His eyes lingered on me for a second longer than I liked before he grabbed a key from the wall. An actual key, not a card. "Room 212, he said, sliding it across the counter. "Second floor, end of the hall." I nodded, took the key, and turned to leave. But just as I reached the door, Carl spoke again. "If you hear anything strange tonight, don't open your door." I stopped mid-step, my hand tightening around the key. I turned back, but Carl had already gone back to watching his TV, like he hadn't said anything at all. I told myself he was just messing with me, trying to spook the out-of-towner, but something about his tone had felt serious. I shook it off and made my way to my room. The motel was eerily quiet, no cars in the lot besides mine, no sounds of other guests, no TVs playing through thin walls, no footsteps, just the wind and the occasional drip of water from the rusting pipes along the walkway. I reached room 212, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The room was exactly what you'd expect. Outdated furniture, a faded floral bedspread, and a dim lamp that barely lit the space. A single window looked out over the empty parking lot, its curtains swaying slightly even though the window was shut. I set my bag down, kicked off my boots, and collapsed onto the bed. That's when I noticed it. The closet door. It was cracked open. Not by much, just an inch, maybe 2. Just enough that the darkness inside seemed to spill out into the room. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. I was sure it had been closed when I walked in. Slowly, I got up and moved toward it. I reached out, hesitated for a second, then yanked it open. Empty. Just a few wooden hangers and an old iron rod running across the top. I let out a breath and closed it again, this time making sure it latched. I tried to ignore the unease creeping up my spine as I climbed back into bed. It was just a closet. Just a draft making the door shift. Nothing more. I turned off the light, closed my eyes, and tried to sleep, and then around 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft scratching sound. At first I thought it was coming from outside, the wind pushing tree branches against the window, but as I fully woke up, I realized it was coming from inside the room, from the closet. I held my breath, listening. The sound was faint but deliberate, a slow, methodical scraping like nails dragging lightly against wood. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was pitch black, but I didn't dare turn on the light. Then, knock, knock. 3 soft knocks, coming from inside the closet. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air in the room had changed, grown heavier, colder. I gripped the edge of the blanket, every muscle in my body tensed. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the closet door creaked open, inch by inch, slowly. I couldn't see anything inside, just darkness, a gaping, endless void. And then, in the silence, I heard something, a whisper, so faint I could barely make out the words. Come closer. I didn't. I grabbed my phone and flicked on the flashlight, aiming it directly at the closet. There was nothing there, but the closet door was now fully open, swaying slightly like someone had just stepped out of it. I grabbed my bag and ran. I didn't stop to check out, didn't stop to lock the door behind me. I just bolted down the stairs, through the lobby, and into my car. As I threw the car into reverse, I glanced up at the motel one last time. The window of room 212 was open, and someone was standing there. Not Carl, not another guest. Someone else. Tall, thin, completely still. Watching me. I peeled out of the parking lot and drove until I saw the first sign of civilization. I found a diner about 30 miles away and stopped for coffee, my hands still shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. I pulled out my phone to check the time. It was 3:47 a.m. That's when I saw it. A new picture in my camera roll. I hadn't taken any pictures that night. With my stomach in my throat, I clicked on it. It was a photo of me, asleep in room 212, taken from inside the closet. I never went back to the Red Pines Inn. I don't know what I would have found if I had. I don't want to know. But sometimes, even now, I wake up in the middle of the night with the overwhelming sense that something is watching me. And every once in a while, just before I drift off to sleep, I hear 3 soft knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Story the end.